Imagine it's 2nd of July 2015. You are a 70-year-old pensioner living in Athens, Greece. Your name is Konstantinos Nikolopoulos, a retired employee of Warner Bros., and your monthly pension is not just your pension anymore. In your apartment, bills sit in a neat pile on the table because in modern Greece, one check often feeds more than one mouth. Your daughter has struggled to find stable work. Your grandson needs shoes before school starts, and the pharmacy downstairs still expects to be paid in cash. So this morning you leave home early, join the line outside the bank, and wait with dozens of other retirees under the summer heat, each of you rehearsing the same small hope, just enough money to get through the week. If you have ever wondered why a family can do everything right for decades and still feel poor in a single season, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before. And it always strips away the same illusion first. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. When the doors finally open, the promise fails. Greece's banks are shut under emergency controls, ATMs are restricted, and pensioners are being told they can collect only a small amount at specially opened branches. Konstantinos emerges empty-handed after being told his fund is not paying out that day. He tells Reuters, with the flat exhaustion of a man who has run out of anger, that the situation is out of control. That is where this story begins, not with charts, not with central bankers, not with abstract words on television, but with a man who worked for years, saved in the system he was told to trust, and then discovered that a bank balance and access to money are not the same thing at all. And that is the heart of this video. Across hyperinflation, bank runs, debt defaults, capital controls, and currency crashes, the families who came through with the least damage had usually made one quiet decision before the panic became visible. They refused to keep every lifeline inside one fragile promise. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Economic collapse almost never begins with empty shelves or lines outside banks. It begins with a mismatch. A mismatch is when the promises in a system grow larger than the real things underneath them. More claims than cash, more debt than income, more imports than foreign currency, more comfort than the state can actually pay for. For a while, this mismatch hides inside normal life the way rot hides inside a painted wall. The wall still looks clean. You can still hang pictures on it, but the strength is already leaving. A bank deposit feels like money, but in a crisis it is often a claim on money. That sounds technical, so let me make it simple. If 10 people believe they each have a full bucket of water, but the village, only has enough water for 6 buckets, then 4 people are not wealthy. They are just late. That is the secret key that unlocks almost every collapse we are about to examine. The state and the banking system do not ask, in the final hour, whether you were virtuous. They ask where your purchasing power lives. Purchasing power means your real ability to buy food, fuel, medicine, rent, time, and options. When the mismatch becomes impossible to hide, the loss has to land somewhere. Sometimes it lands through inflation, which means prices rise so fast that money shrinks in your hand like ice in the sun. Sometimes it lands through devaluation, which means the local currency suddenly buys far less of the outside world. Sometimes it lands through capital controls, which means the government limits how much of your own money you can move or withdraw. Sometimes it lands through a bail-in, which means depositors themselves are forced to absorb bank losses. Different names, same result. The system reaches into private lives and pulls out time, savings, and certainty. This brings us directly to the first part of the pattern. In some collapses, the trap is not that your money is frozen. It is that your money is moving so fast in the wrong direction that holding it becomes the danger. Look at Germany in 1923. The Weimar Republic had been weakened by war debts, reparation payments, falling confidence, and then a fresh shock when French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr in January 1923. The German government backed passive resistance in the region and paid idle workers by issuing more and more money. At first, this looked like a way to keep society from breaking apart. In reality, it was like trying to put out a kitchen fire with lamp oil. Britannica describes the mark plunging from 162 to the dollar in early 1922 to more than 7,000 later that year, then to 160,000 per dollar on July 1st, 1923, 242 million per dollar on October 1st, and 4.2 trillion per dollar by November 20th. In another Britannica account, a loaf of bread that cost 20,000 marks in the morning could cost 5 million by nightfall. Imagine trying to budget a household when the floor moves between breakfast and dinner. What did ordinary people experience? Not just high prices. Chaos in the rhythm of life itself. Workers were paid twice a day because waiting until evening could destroy the value of the morning's wages. Restaurant prices changed while customers were still eating. A lifetime of savings would no longer buy a subway ticket. Pensions designed to support old age were wiped out completely. The middle class, which had believed itself protected by thrift and order, found that thrift had become a trap. If you kept your wealth in cash or fixed claims, the currency ate you alive. Hyperinflation is often pictured with wheelbarrows of banknotes, but the real image is quieter than that. It is a widow opening a drawer full of saved paper and realizing it has become confetti. And yet even here, the historical record shows a dividing line. The people who suffered least were not necessarily the richest or the smartest. They were often the people who understood early that the mark was no longer a storehouse. A storehouse is where you keep value safely over time. They moved quickly from money into things that could not be printed: food, coal, inventory, foreign currency, productive land, business stock. Some debtors even saw their burdens evaporate because loans were repaid in ruined currency. That is one of collapse's cruel jokes. The careful saver is punished. The owner of assets, or the person with access to hard currency, often walks away less damaged. The same storm that drowns paper can float timber. This does not mean everyone could escape. Most people could not. That is precisely why the lesson matters. Weimar Germany reveals the first face of collapse, when the currency itself becomes the burning building. In that world, the one decision that mattered was refusing to stand in the doorway holding nothing but cash. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. If your savings can vanish without the number in your account ever going to zero, what exactly were you saving in the first place? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously, because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes everything. This leads to the second part of the story. Sometimes the money keeps its face, but the door to it is locked. Argentina in 2001 did not look like Weimar Germany. There were no wheelbarrows of notes racing down city streets. The trap was colder and more modern. During the 1990s, Argentina had tied the peso 1-to-1 with the US dollar. For a while, the peg looked like a miracle. Inflation fell. Foreign money flowed in. The country was praised as a model reform story. But the stability was brittle. It depended on confidence, borrowing, and a fixed exchange regime that became harder and harder to defend as capital fled. By 2001, Reuters reports unemployment had risen beyond 20%. The Yale Journal of Financial Crises notes that more than 2/3 of bank deposits were denominated in dollars. People believed they had dollars in the system. The problem was that belief and access were drifting apart. When depositors began pulling money out faster, the run accelerated on November 28, 2001. On December 1st, authorities imposed what became infamous as the Corralito, restricting withdrawals from demand deposit accounts to 250 pesos, or $250 US per week per account holder across institutions. Think about what that means at household level. Your rent is due, your wholesaler wants payment, your employee needs wages, your child needs medicine, and the system calmly informs you that your life will now be dispensed in weekly rations. A bank account that looked like a full pantry became a photograph of a pantry. You could see the food, you just could not eat it. The social damage was immediate and brutal. Riots broke out. Supermarkets were looted. ATMs were vandalized. President Fernando de la Rua resigned amid unrest, and within 2 weeks, Argentina tore through 5 presidents. On December 21st, a bank holiday was declared. During that holiday, the government defaulted on about $141 billion of foreign debt, one of the largest sovereign defaults in history. In January 2002, the convertibility regime ended, the peso was devalued, and the meaning of a bank deposit changed again when dollar claims were converted under new rules. Reuters later described the broader crisis as an economic meltdown that shrank the economy by roughly a fifth before it ended, tossing millions of middle-class Argentines into poverty. Output contracted 10.9% in 2002 alone. Now here's where it gets interesting. The people who came through this period with options were often the people who had not confused banking convenience with final safety. Reuters reported years later that Argentines old enough to remember the Corralito still preferred to keep savings at home. One 70-year-old depositor named Stella said plainly that she preferred to have her savings at home because it was her insurance for the next few years. That instinct did not come from paranoia. It came from memory. Families who had some cash outside the banking freeze, access to dollars, relatives abroad, goods to barter, or fewer fixed monthly obligations were not untouched, but they were not pinned flat against the wall either. The winners, if we can even use that word in a national trauma, were the people who had separated at least part of their survival from one domestic banking promise. And notice the mechanism. Argentina did not need to destroy every banknote in your hand to hurt you. It only had to control access. The injury came not from zero wealth on paper, but from zero freedom in practice. Collapse is not always a hammer. Sometimes it is a turnstile. Now let us move to a third case, because this pattern did not end in the 20th century, And it did not stay in emerging markets far from Europe. It reached the Eurozone itself. In March 2013, Cyprus became the laboratory for something many ordinary savers had never imagined. The island's banking sector had swollen to enormous size relative to the economy, heavily exposed to Greek losses and dependent on outside support. When that structure failed, the rescue did not arrive as a clean refill from above. It arrived as a bill handed to depositors. Reuters reported that when banks reopened after nearly 2 weeks of shutdown, capital controls limited cash withdrawals to €300 per day, banned the cashing of checks, capped card spending abroad at €5,000 per month, and limited how much cash people could take off the island. More important still, deposits above €100,000 in Bank of Cyprus were forced into a bail-in. Later, Reuters reported that 47.5% of those uninsured deposits would be converted into equity to recapitalize the bank. Another Reuters report described major customers facing losses around 60% once all terms were considered. Pause on that for a moment. A bail-in sounds clinical. The phrase sits there like hospital equipment, polished and neutral. In plain English, it meant that savers inside the bank were drafted into the rescue. The safe itself became the source of the sacrifice. Many people had assumed they were holding money. In reality, they were holding a vulnerable claim on a leveraged institution. A leveraged institution is one that has stretched itself with borrowed money and promises. When the rope snapped, the hands nearest the knot were burned first. What did ordinary people see? Reuters quoted Tryphonas Neocleus, a clothes shop owner in Nicosia, saying Europe had turned Cyprus from paradise into hell. He did not expect business to pick up even after banks reopened. Why would it? A modern economy does not run on account balances alone. It runs on confidence that the balances are usable. If households and firms fear that money in one place is worth less than money elsewhere, then the currency starts to split inside people's minds. Reuters even noted warnings about a second-class Cyprus euro, meaning euros trapped on the island could become less valuable in practice than euros abroad. Same nominal unit, different lived reality, like being given a key that only opens your door on certain days. Again, the pattern shows itself. Those most damaged were not necessarily reckless gamblers. Many were business owners, savers, retirees, and families who had concentrated liquidity in the very institutions that failed. Those least damaged were often the ones with diversified banking relationships, external income, assets outside the domestic bank loop, or less money exposed above the insured threshold. They had not escaped the storm, but they had not tied every boat to the same dock. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. Germany in 1923, Argentina in 2001, Cyprus in 2013, different countries, different decades, different political stories, same mechanism. In every case, a society built more claims than it could honor under stress. In Germany, too much money chased too few real goods and confidence snapped. In Argentina, the banking and currency system could not satisfy depositors once confidence drained out and dollars became scarce. In Cyprus, oversized banks and bad assets left a hole so large that depositors themselves were pulled into filling it. 3 costumes, 1 actor. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. The public is usually told that collapse arrives as an unexpected event, a shock, a surprise, a sudden tragedy. But when you examine the bones of these crises, you find something else. The final panic is sudden. The underlying weakness is not. It grows quietly in years when things still look normal, high yields that seem too generous, fixed exchange rates treated like permanent laws of nature, banking systems growing faster than the economy beneath them, government spending as if foreign money will always return, households mistaking digital access for unquestioned ownership. The crisis is the moment the photograph catches up with the long exposure. This is why the one decision matters so much. The families who came through collapse best were not the ones who predicted the exact day. Almost nobody does. They were the ones who refused a more basic illusion. They did not leave every form of security in one single promise, especially a promise issued by a stressed state, a fragile bank, or a currency already under strain. They spread risk across forms the crisis could not hit in the same way at the same time. In one era, that meant land, goods, and foreign notes. In another, it meant cash outside the frozen banking rail, income from abroad, or lower dependence on monthly withdrawals. The details changed. The principle did not. When one room of the house caught fire, they had already placed something valuable in another room. Look at what happened next in Greece, because Greece shows how this same mechanism can humiliate people even when the currency itself survives. In June 2015, after a renewed run on banks and a breakdown in talks with creditors, the Greek government announced a bank holiday and capital controls. Reuters reported that ATMs would be closed at first and then limited to €60 a day for holders of Greek bank cards. The initial bank shutdown was set for 6 working days, though restrictions lasted much longer, and banks did not reopen until July 20th. For pensioners without cards, special branches were opened to issue only small amounts, with Reuters describing a maximum payout of €120. Long lines formed. Television replayed the scenes again and again. Greece had spent years arguing over debt ratios and bailout terms, but in the public imagination, the crisis condensed into one image: old people queuing for their own money. Reuters quoted Konstantinos Nikolopoulos, the man from our opening, after he emerged empty-handed. His pension fund was not paying out that day. In a country where 1 in 4 workers was unemployed and many families depended on grandparents' benefits as their only stable income, this was not just a banking inconvenience, it was a pressure point on whole households. When a pension is feeding 3 generations, a €60 daily limit is not a technical policy. It is a knife-slicing time into anxious pieces. And if Greece showed restriction, Lebanon showed slow suffocation. Lebanon's financial collapse began in 2019 after years of debt, dependence on foreign inflows, and what some economists described, in Reuters reporting, as a nationally regulated Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme is a system that uses new money to pay old promises until the new money stops coming. For years, Lebanon offered strikingly high interest rates to attract dollars into a system pegged at about 1,500 Lebanese pounds to the dollar. It felt stable. It looked stable. Supermarkets, households, and businesses lived inside that stability. Then the inflows dried up. Banks shut their doors to ordinary depositors. Reuters reported that savers were locked out of dollar accounts or told their accessible funds were worth only a fraction of the original value. The currency fell from that 500 to the dollar before the crisis to about 23,000 by late January 2022, after hitting 34,000 earlier that month. The human cost was written in kitchen language, not policy language. Reuters profiled Sarah Wissam, a schoolteacher in Beirut and a mother of 3. Before the crisis, she and her husband earned about 3 million Lebanese pounds a month, worth around $2,000 at the old rate. By 2022, even after a modest raise, their combined income was worth about $140. She said what used to last a month was no longer enough for one trip to the supermarket. She cut meat, cut cheese, and measured small treats for her children carefully. Another Beirut resident, Yola Al-Musan, had to race to start her washing machine whenever the national grid briefly came alive, because electricity from the state was often down to about an hour a day. Shadi Ali Hamoud came home from his restaurant kitchen and looked at an empty fridge. This is what collapse does. It turns national balance sheet problems into a mother standing in an aisle doing arithmetic over cheese. Zimbabwe gives us perhaps the most brutal example of the same damage to ordinary savers. Reuters reported that inflation in the 2008 crisis peaked at 500 billion%, wiping out pensions, savings, and confidence in the currency. Another Reuters fact box from late 2008 put official annual inflation at 231 million% in July, with economists saying prices were doubling daily. Unemployment was estimated above 90%. Per capita GDP had collapsed from near $900 in 1990 to about $200 by 2007. In such conditions, salary earners and pensioners are not just injured, they are sandblasted. Money stops behaving like memory. It forgets what it was supposed to hold. Now put Greece, Lebanon, and Zimbabwe beside Germany, Argentina, and Cyprus. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The people hurt most are usually those who live from fixed claims inside the system: pensioners, salary workers, small business owners with cash flow needs, families with savings in local banks and expenses in the real world. The middle class is especially vulnerable because it tends to trust institutions enough to save inside them, but lacks the scale, legal tools, or international escape routes of the very wealthy. Meanwhile, people with foreign income, productive assets, inventories, political access, or large debts that get inflated away often suffer less. Not because they are morally better, because they are positioned differently relative to the fault line. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. So what historically did the survivors do? Not the gurus selling certainty after the fact, not the loudest voices online, the actual households that made it through with less damage. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods largely shared a few deep traits, even when their countries, politics, and currencies were completely different. First, they valued access over appearance. They understood that a beautiful account statement can be like a painted window. It looks open until you try to climb through it. In Argentina, families who had some cash outside the freeze or access to dollars were not forced to beg the weekly limit for every decision. In Greece, those with some notes at home or support from relatives could navigate days that others spent in line. In Lebanon, remittances from family abroad became lifelines because they existed partly outside the broken domestic loop. In every case, survival improved when not every necessity depended on one card, one branch, one withdrawal rule, or one government promise. Second, they owned or controlled things that held usefulness even when money failed. Usefulness matters because crises attack symbols first and necessities second. A symbol is a number in an account. A necessity is food, fuel, medicine, rent, transport, inventory, tools, shelter, and the means to earn. In Weimar Germany, people who turned wages into goods quickly or held real assets were often less destroyed than those who clung to cash. In Zimbabwe, where pensions and paper savings were pulverized, informal trade and hard currency became more real than official promises. In Cyprus, business owners with operations or relationships outside the domestic banking bottleneck had at least some room to breathe. History keeps repeating the same harsh sentence: what is useful survives longer than what is merely denominated. Third, they had lower dependence on rigid monthly obligations. This is not glamorous, but it matters. A family carrying heavy fixed costs in a collapse is like a diver with stones tied to his ankles. When income freezes or the currency breaks, every fixed payment becomes heavier at once. Families with modest lifestyles, supportive kin, village property, kitchen gardens, side income, or the ability to cut costs without total ruin had more resilience. Resilience means the ability to bend without snapping. It is not exciting in good times. It is priceless in bad times. Notice what I'm not saying. I'm not saying there is one perfect asset, one magical hedge, or one timeless formula. History does not offer that. It offers something more useful and less comforting. It shows that collapse punishes concentration. It punishes blind trust in any single financial pipe, and it rewards optionality. Optionality means having more than one workable path when the main road closes. The one decision, then, was not some secret trade. It was the decision to stop keeping every lifeline in the same system, in the same form, under the same political risk. There is one more uncomfortable fact buried in these histories, and most people miss it because they picture collapse as something loud and obvious. Very often, the decisive move is made before the crisis feels dramatic. It is made in the boring years, in the years when the salary still lands on time, in the years when the bank app still opens in 1 second, in the years when politicians insist the situation is manageable. Families rarely save themselves during the stampede. They save themselves beforehand, when caution still looks unnecessary and even old-fashioned. That is why the survivors in these episodes can seem almost unimpressive from the outside. They were not always chasing the highest return. Sometimes they accepted lower returns in exchange for more control. Sometimes they kept part of their liquidity close at hand instead of optimizing every last percentage point. Sometimes they tolerated the inefficiency of diversification because efficiency in a single system can become fragility overnight. A tree planted in one rich patch of soil grows fast. A forest spread across different ground survives storms. Another counterintuitive fact is that sophistication can increase vulnerability. The more modern and frictionless a financial system becomes, the easier it is to forget what money really is. A swipe, a tap, a glowing number, an automatic transfer, it all feels immediate. But history shows that convenience is not the same as sovereignty. Sovereignty means real control. In Cyprus, people had euro balances in modern banks inside the eurozone and still discovered that access could be narrowed, delayed, and redefined. In Lebanon, depositors with dollar accounts learned that the label on the account mattered less than the terms of withdrawal. In Argentina, people who thought they had hard currency in the banking system found themselves rationed anyway. The smoother the glass, the harder it is to notice the crack. This is also why the middle class suffers so consistently in collapse. The poor often have fewer formal savings to lose, though they suffer terribly in wages, food, and public services. The rich often have lawyers, offshore access, diversified holdings, and political reach. The middle class has enough to trust the system and not enough to outrun it. It saves in pensions, deposits, and salaries. It plans, it delays gratification. It does the responsible thing. Then a crisis arrives and reveals that responsibility inside a broken structure can become a form of exposure. History can be brutally unfair in that way. It does not always reward discipline directly. It rewards discipline combined with realism. And that realism still matters now, not as prophecy, but as pattern recognition. Whenever you see a country leaning too heavily on debt, on foreign inflows, on an overgrown banking sector, on a rigid peg, on permanent low rates, or on public confidence that nobody feels the need to question, the rhyme begins. Whenever households believe all safety can be outsourced to one employer, one pension pipe, one bank, one currency arrangement, or one political promise, the rhyme deepens. None of this proves a collapse is coming to any specific place. History is not that neat. But it does show where the stress usually concentrates when confidence breaks. So the decision that saved families was never really about being cynical. It was about being structurally humble. It was the decision to admit that any single system, no matter how advanced, can fail at the exact moment people need it most. That humility is not fear. It is architecture. It is building your life. So one broken hinge does not take the whole door off the house. And that brings us back to Konstantinos in Athens, waiting outside a bank that could not behave like a bank. He was not foolish. Neither were the German pensioners whose life savings dissolved in 1923, the Argentine families rationed to $250 a week in 2001, the Cypriot depositors drafted into a bank rescue in 2013, the Lebanese teachers watching salaries collapse after 2019, or the Zimbabwean pensioners erased by runaway inflation in 2008. They were ordinary people living inside systems that looked solid until they didn't. That is why this lesson matters. Collapse rarely announces itself with a trumpet. It creeps in like water under a door, and by the time the carpet feels wet, the level is already rising. History does not tell us exactly what comes next in any country. It is not a crystal ball. It is a lighthouse. It shows where other ships hit the rocks, and what separated the vessels that sank from the ones that limped home. Again and again, the dividing line was simple, almost boring, and therefore easy to ignore in good times. The families who survived best had already chosen not to store all their safety in one promise. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.